9,400,000 square kilometers, an area equivalent to the entire United States, defines the Sahara Desert as a geological titan of heat that relentlessly expands its borders. While international governments engage in protracted debates, millions of individuals are currently confronting this environmental collapse using their own physical labor. They do not utilize concrete barriers or complex futuristic machinery, but instead rely on specific semicircular pits excavated into the hardened earth. Why does a simple hole in the ground succeed where billions of dollars in advanced technology have historically failed? The region of the Sahel serves as the primary battlefield, forming a semi-arid belt that stretches across more than 20 African nations. One can notice how the life of hundreds of millions of people remains precariously balanced on the edge of survival in this environment. The paradox of this landscape is that it does not perish from a lack of water in the conventional sense. Every year, the atmosphere releases brief rainy seasons characterized by extreme physical violence. Rainwater strikes the surface with enough kinetic energy to fracture stone, yet the ground consistently refuses to absorb the moisture. But this is just the beginning of the technical challenge. The true mechanical enemy is not the solar radiation, but the structural state of the Earth's crust. Decades of persistent drought and land degradation have transmuted the topsoil into an impenetrable armor as rigid as industrial asphalt. When torrential downpours hit this protective shield, the liquid cannot infiltrate the subsurface layers. Instead, it flows uncontrollably across the horizontal plane, generating flash floods that erode the minimal remains of fertile sediment before vanishing. It only looks obvious that rain should bring life, but in reality, this is a destructive cycle where drought bakes the soil into a dead state and the subsequent rain washes the biological remains away. Desertification represents the total failure of the soil's natural hydraulic engineering. For several decades, global initiatives attempted to counter this process through raw financial power and large-scale planting efforts. International campaigns invested billions of dollars to establish massive forests, placing billions of saplings into the ground to construct a green barrier against the sands. The equipment and human effort involved were immense, but nature does not overlook fundamental mechanical errors. A significant majority of these reforestation projects ended in catastrophic failure, with tree mortality rates reaching 80 or 90% after only 2 seasons. The process is only gaining momentum as researchers analyze these past mistakes. The fundamental error was technical. Engineers attempted to install biological life into a hardware system that was fundamentally broken. Planting trees in a substrate that has lost its capacity for water retention is functionally identical to pouring liquid into a bucket with a perforated base. Regardless of the volume of resources applied, the physical result remains a void. It became necessary to set aside technological arrogance and return to the principles of basic physics to find a viable solution. One can notice how the focus shifted away from high-tech laboratories toward the mechanical manipulation of the terrain itself. This transition to a more precise understanding of hydrology marked the start of a more effective strategy in the silent war for the planet. The manual excavation of the Earth prepares the landscape for a slow and deliberate recovery of its natural functions. Millions of manual laborers first made the strategic decision to prioritize the stabilization of the soil through mechanical intervention. Why is the weapon chosen for this task designed with such deceptive simplicity as a semicircular pit? This hydraulic trap appears as a basic earthwork, yet its function is a calculated response to the laws of fluid dynamics. Millions of farmers operate under a suffocating heat that exceeds 40 degrees, sculpting the parched landscape with only the rhythmic strikes of shovels and heavy pickaxes. The laborers do not excavate straight lines or traditional trenches. One can notice how they carve precise arcs positioned strategically against the natural inclination of the terrain. This crescent shape is not decorative, as it serves as a perfect hydraulic interceptor for surface runoff. When rainwater descends the slope with the momentum of an out-of-control train, the moon-shaped curve catches the flow. The arc forces the liquid to decelerate, spread its volume across a wider surface area, and, most critically, remain stationary for a calculated duration. But this is just the beginning. It acts as a literal emergency brake constructed entirely from compacted earth. The technical specifications for these structures remain rigorous to ensure maximum efficiency. Each individual pit measures between 4 and 6 meters in diameter, but the depth is kept surprisingly shallow at 20 to 40 centimeters. The objective of the engineering is not to create a deep pool where evaporation would occur rapidly. Instead, the design facilitates a wide basin that provides the necessary time for physics to perform its work, allowing gravity to pull the moisture into the deep subsoil. The equipment gradually directs the liquid away from the intense radiation of the sun. A single human being, relying on physical determination, is capable of excavating one of these crescent structures in exactly 1 hour. The process is only gaining momentum. It represents a zero-cost technology with infinite scalability across vast geographical zones. The soil lays in an even layer around the rim of the arc, reinforcing the structure against future erosion. One can notice the dust slowly settle as the farmer moves to the next position. This method ensures that the landscape is ready to transition to the next level of restoration. 40 to 60% of the original vegetation cover returns to lands once considered biologically dead in a period of only 2 to 5 years. Why does such a radical transformation occur in the arid landscapes of Niger and Burkina Faso? It only looks obvious to attribute this to luck or shifting weather patterns, but in reality, specific field studies prove that targeted soil restoration defies conventional logic. Where 0% vegetation once existed on barren earth, islands of green shrubs and native plants now emerge from the red dust. The process is only gaining momentum. One can notice how trees begin to return spontaneously as the soil regains its natural ability to absorb and retain moisture. It seems simple to assume that rainfall alone solves the crisis, but the earth must first be prepared to drink again. But this is just the beginning of the struggle against the environment. In the relentless heat of the African continent, capturing the water in the ground is merely the primary phase of the operation. Everything only gets more complicated when the most aggressive predator in the region enters the equation. Evaporation is the force that threatens every drop of accumulated liquid. In an open water reservoir, the intense African sun is capable of stealing up to 90% of the total volume through thermal energy. This is a physical tax on survival that the local population cannot afford to pay. Transition to the next level. Engineers in Kenya have completely reversed their technical approach to solve this critical problem. They realized that traditional storage methods were insufficient against the atmospheric pressure and heat. One can notice how the focus shifts from mere collection to the sophisticated protection of every liter. The equipment and methods used to shield these resources have undergone a total evolution. This concludes the phase of recognizing the environmental threat, opening the road to structural innovation. 1 million liters of water or more are secured within a single structure by turning the traditional concept of a dam completely upside down. Why build a concrete wall to hold back a liquid lake when the sun will simply evaporate the moisture within days? Instead of creating an open reservoir, engineers and local communities construct barriers made of stone or concrete directly across the beds of seasonal rivers to trap solid sediment. This approach ensures that the primary resource being harvested is not just the water itself, but the heavy sand carried by seasonal floods. Sand dams function as a deliberate trap for the earth. It is visible how the heavy sediment accumulates behind the wall during every flash flood, gradually building a massive artificial beach where there was once only a dry gully. But this is just the beginning. The technical genius of the design lies in the physics of the sand grains, as the water hides itself within the microscopic empty spaces between the particles. One can notice how the surface remains dry, while a subterranean vault forms beneath, protected from the atmosphere. At first glance, it seems simple to just block a river, but in reality, this method creates a natural filtration system and a thermal shield. The thick layer of sand protects the moisture from the scorching sun, reducing evaporation rates to almost zero. The process is only gaining momentum as the water remains accessible through simple wells, even when the surface of the riverbed appears dusty and completely parched. Communities that have implemented this specific technique have seen their daily reality transformed. Water availability has triplicated in regions where scarcity was once the absolute norm. The yield of vital crops like millet and maize has spiked by 50 to 100% due to the consistent moisture supply. It gets more complex further on. Stone lines are often used in conjunction with these dams to stabilize the surrounding landscape. These are simple rows of rocks placed along the contours of agricultural fields to function as speed bumps for rainwater. The equipment is humble, yet the camera glides along miles of these ridges that force the water to soak into the soil rather than washing away the nutrients. Everything only gets more complicated as one considers the scale of these invisible structures serving as the backbone of a regional agricultural revolution. These technologies demonstrate that there is no requirement to reinvent the wheel, but rather a need to observe the physical mechanics of the planet. While Africa continues its efforts to capture every drop of rain through these earthen interventions, the focus shifts across the globe. In China, the struggle involves a different elemental force in the form of a solid, moving ocean. 100,000 square kilometers of shifting dunes define the Taklamakan Desert, where the next phase of engineering begins. 1,000 millimeters of rainfall per year is considered a standard for many regions, but here, the total precipitation barely reaches 100 millimeters over 365 days. Why does this land bear a name that translates as the place where one who enters never leaves? At first glance, the environmental hostility seems impossible to overcome, as the conditions mirror those of another planet entirely. To visualize the extreme aridity of this terrain, imagine pouring a single half-liter bottle of water onto 1 square meter of earth and requiring that moisture to sustain the ground for an entire week under an unforgiving sun. This territory is 10 times drier than the deserts of California, but the primary threat is not merely the absence of water. The danger lies in the constant mobility of the landscape. One can notice how the massive sand dunes do not remain stationary, but instead migrate across the horizon with the wind. The process is only gaining momentum as the sand moves forward, systematically engalloping critical infrastructure, entire roads, and ancient history. During the decade of the 1990s, the ecological crisis reached a breaking point that affected the capital city. Beijing, situated thousands of kilometers away from this wasteland, began to suffocate under the weight of dust and grit. The process is only gaining momentum as the city endured more than 80 days of intense sandstorms every single year. The camera glides along the hazy skyline, where the atmosphere transformed into a thick, opaque orange. It is visible how the air became completely unbreathable for millions of residents as the desert expanded its reach. But this is just the beginning of the struggle. The response from China was to mobilize the largest environmental project in human history to halt the advancing sand. The strategy involved a massive deployment of resources to stabilize the shifting dunes before they could reach further into the heart of the country. This transition to the next level of intervention was the only way to protect the future of the habitable regions. Everything only gets more complicated as the scale of the reclamation efforts increases. The material and labor required for such a task signify the transition into a new phase of national defense against the elements. 4,500 kilometers is the total length of the living shield being constructed for the most ambitious ecological project in history. Why attempt to plant 35 million hectares of forest in a terrain that behaves like a shifting liquid? At first glance, the task of stabilizing a sea of sand seems impossible, but in reality, the Great Green Wall of China relies on a calculated foundation to stop the desert from advancing. This initiative, known as the 3 North Shelter Forest Program, aims for completion by the year 2050. Engineers began by mapping the inherent chaos of the dunes using a network of satellites and high-altitude drones. They transformed the unpredictable movement of the sand into a geometric battle plan known as the straw checkerboard. The process is only gaining momentum. One can notice how workers cover the desert surface with an infinite grid of straw squares. Each individual square measures exactly 1 meter by 1 meter, creating a stable mechanical barrier against the wind. It only looks obvious to lay straw on the ground, but in reality, this grid increases surface roughness and reduces the wind speed near the soil to nearly zero. The camera glides along the repetitive patterns where the straw is buried 10 centimeters deep into the sand with specialized tools. Because the straw remains upright, it creates a microenvironment that traps moisture and prevents the dunes from migrating. It gets more complex further on. Therefore, these geometric cells act as the primary defense, allowing the first seeds and shrubs to take root without being buried by the shifting landscape. The equipment gradually moves across the dunes, leaving behind a rigid structure that mimics a massive chessboard. Metal blades press the dry stalks into the arid ground with repetitive, rhythmic force. Everything only gets more complicated as the scale increases across thousands of kilometers of wasteland. Transition to the next level. One can notice how the golden straw provides a stark visual contrast against the pale yellow of the moving desert. This foundation allows for the eventual introduction of trees that will form the permanent forest belt. The process continues systematically, square by square, across the vast geography of the North. Millions of tons of straw are transported into the absolute heart of the wilderness, where the logistical scale becomes truly overwhelming. Why is such a massive volume of organic material moved into a landscape where roads simply do not exist? At first glance, the task appears impossible, as heavy transport trucks frequently sink up to their metal axles in the soft, shifting sand. But the resistance of the terrain is only the first obstacle in this industrial-scale reclamation project. The process is only gaining momentum. Human effort serves as the primary engine of this operation under conditions where the temperature frequently climbs above 49 degrees Celsius. One can notice how an army of workers advances steadily across the massive dunes, carrying out tasks that no machine can replicate on such unstable ground. Because the slopes of the sand dunes are too steep and the surface too unpredictable, heavy mechanical equipment cannot be utilized for the installation. Everything only gets more complicated as the workers rely exclusively on their hands and manual shovels to manipulate the landscape. The labor involves placing the straw in perfectly straight lines and carefully burying the center of each bundle deep into the sand while leaving the ends standing upright. It is visible how the golden desert gradually transforms into a colossal chessboard pattern that stretches endlessly toward the horizon. It gets more complex further on. This geometric transformation is not a pursuit of aesthetics, but a manifestation of pure applied aerodynamics. The upright straw creates constant physical friction against the air currents moving across the surface. It is visible how the stalks lift the atmospheric boundary layer, preventing the wind from gaining the velocity required to displace the sand particles. The equipment remains silent as the manual labor establishes this protective grid against the elements. Through this systematic placement, the energy of the wind is broken, and the movement of the dunes is halted by the calculated resistance of the straw barrier. This concludes the primary stabilization phase, leaving the terrain prepared for the subsequent stages of environmental management. 1 meter by 1 meter is the exact size of the protective cells that now cover the once shifting desert floor. Why go to the trouble of weaving millions of these straw squares across the dunes? It only looks obvious to assume the sand is simply being covered, but in reality, this creates a physical barrier that disrupts the laminar airflow. The straw grids break the aerodynamic force, drastically reducing wind speed at the ground level, where the air used to drag sand particles and bury everything in its path. Now the sand remains trapped within these straw saddles. One can notice how the dune is effectively immobilized, held fast in a cage constructed of dried grass to domesticate a geological beast. But this is just the beginning. The geometric prison is not the final objective, but rather a sophisticated nursery for ecological restoration. Into each of these millions of squares, Chinese machinery and human hands introduce biological life. Mechanical drills pierce the center of every individual cell to plant seedlings of extremophile species such as the saxaul and the red willow. These are not common plants, but evolutionary survivors specifically adapted to withstand this thermal hell. Everything only gets more complicated as the process gains momentum. Precise placement is required for every seedling. The equipment gradually buries the roots deep into the substrate, where they must seek moisture. The straw that currently serves as a shield against the wind performs one last act of sacrifice. It seems simple, but the organic material eventually rots away. As it decomposes, it transforms into a layer of nutrients that enriches the barren ground. The material is ready to move to the next processing phase without haste. 100% natural fertilizer provides the essential nutrients that nourish the root systems of the young saplings. Why does such a basic organic material hold the power to revitalize an entire landscape? At first glance, the installation looks like a lifeless construction of dry, yellow straw. But in reality, it serves as the critical catalyst for a developing and vibrant ecosystem. The transformation begins when the organic matter breaks down and seeps into the parched earth below. It gets more complex further on. One can notice how the tree roots gradually descend several meters into the depths of the arid terrain. These biological anchors grip the internal structure of the sand dunes with mechanical force, effectively stabilizing the shifting grains and converting them into solid, permanent soil. The equipment does not drive this change. The biology does. It is visible how the wind no longer carries the top layer of the dunes away, as the roots create an interlocking subterranean grid. Everything only gets more complicated as the scale increases. 25% is the current extent of the forest cover in China, marking a massive leap from the 10% recorded in the year 1949. In those regions where only the silence of desolation and the abrasive sound of the wind previously existed, the technical observer now detects the distinct rustling of leaves moving in the breeze. The process is only gaining momentum. Africa and China demonstrate two entirely distinct pathways for large-scale ecological engineering and land restoration. Each method utilizes specific local materials and physical principles to achieve a measurable change in the environment. From here, the transformation moves to the next phase of processing without haste. 100% of the success in reclaiming arid landscapes depends on the strategic adaptation to environmental physics rather than resisting them. Why is the geometry of the intervention more critical than the sheer volume of material moved? At first glance, the process seems simple, but in reality, the spatial arrangement of the soil determines whether a region remains a desert or returns to fertility. In the Sahel, engineers and laborers utilize the crescent moon shape to create a physical invitation for moisture to remain in the earth. The process is only gaining momentum. One can notice how the curved embankments intercept the sparse rainfall, forcing the water to decelerate and penetrate the parched soil layers. This method relies on the fundamental laws of gravity and fluid dynamics to transform a barren surface into a functional basin. It is visible how the water settles within these earthen arcs, providing life to seeds that would otherwise be swept away by the wind. In China, the strategic approach to victory over the desert takes the form of a rigid, geometric grid designed to force the shifting sands into a state of obedience. This massive logistical operation uses mechanical resistance to stabilize dunes that threaten to bury infrastructure. One can notice the precision with which these barriers are installed, creating a structural lattice that breaks the momentum of the wind. Everything only gets more complicated when considering the scale of these efforts. It only looks obvious that advanced machinery is the primary requirement for environmental restoration. But in reality, the most profound lessons from these two disparate regions are both humilhante and powerful in their simplicity. There is no requirement for speculative technologies or science fiction solutions to preserve the planetary ecosystem. Success requires a deep comprehension of the elemental forces of nature, specifically the behavior of gravity, the path of the wind, and the movement of water. Whether a technician uses a single rusted shovel in the heat of the Sahel or directs a massive industrial logistics chain in East Asia, the physical principles remain identical. The equipment gradually reshapes the topography to work in harmony with natural cycles, rather than in opposition to them. The transition to a sustainable landscape concludes this phase, opening the road to long-term ecological stability. 100,000 hectares of reclaimed land have proven that industrial persistence is capable of healing the deep scars left on the earth. Why do engineers invest decades into such grueling environmental restoration? It only looks obvious that nature recovers on its own, but the damage from massive industrial extraction requires an equally massive human intervention. Without a calculated strategy of replanting and soil stabilization, the arid wasteland would continue to expand, swallowing the surrounding ecosystems permanently. When the camera glides along satellite imagery from previous decades, one can notice how the oppressive yellow stains of the desert are steadily retreating before an advancing wall of green vegetation. This shift in the landscape demonstrates that the most powerful tool in the modern arsenal is not the heavy machinery itself, but the collective will to persist in the face of ecological collapse. The desert may appear vast and intimidating, but in reality it is not an invincible force when confronted with systematic reforestation and water management. The process is only gaining momentum. Technical monitors tracking the expansion of these green zones revealed that the biological density increases by several percentage points every single year. But this is just the beginning. One can notice how a simple can of tomato paste or the rich sauce covering a pizza represents a complex journey of agricultural engineering. It seems simple at first glance, but every single unit of product involves a chain of harvesting, processing, and preservation that spans several continents. The equipment gradually transforms raw produce into the concentrated substance found on kitchen shelves around the globe. Everything only gets more complicated when considering the sheer volume of logistics required to maintain this supply. Automated sorting systems separate thousands of tomatoes per minute based on color, weight, and acidity levels to ensure the final product remains uniform. Transition to the next level. The industrial process continues to evolve, turning basic raw materials into the essential components of daily life through relentless technical precision. Thus ends one of the key stages of observing the intersection between nature and industry. 100 days of scorching sun is the minimum time this fragile fruit must endure to survive its journey from a seedling smaller than the head of a pin to your dinner table. Why must such a delicate organism be forced to withstand the brutal, crushing force of multi-ton harvesters? It only looks obvious that a soft fruit would be destroyed under such industrial weight. But in reality, specialized engineering prevents a total loss of the global food supply. This is the transformation of millions of vulnerable crops into a stable commodity without crushing the harvest in the process. Before a single green sprout ever ruptures the dry crust of the earth, a silent war is waged within the soil. But this is just the beginning. The battle for a record-breaking harvest does not actually originate with the seed itself, but with the meticulous engineering of the terrain. Under the pale light of the early dawn, massive tractors equipped with reinforced steel plows tear through the compacted earth. One can notice how the metal blades slice through the resistance of the ground, moving at a steady and calculated pace. The objective of this mechanical assault is not merely to dig, but to facilitate oxygenation. They revolve thousands of pounds of earth to allow atmospheric air to penetrate deep into the substrate. This creates a specific subterranean environment where the root systems will eventually be able to breathe. However, raw mechanical force is never sufficient on its own. Everything only gets more complicated as science enters the field to refine the process. The soil is treated with the same precision as a patient in a high-tech emergency room, where every chemical and physical parameter is monitored. It is visible how the heavy machinery maneuvers with GPS-guided accuracy to ensure that the soil density remains perfectly uniform across hundreds of acres. The equipment gradually prepares the foundation for the next stage of the industrial cycle. From here, the transformation moves to the next phase of processing as the earth settles into its new aerated structure. 100% precision is the standard maintained in specialized laboratories where researchers determine the exact level of essential nutrients required for the soil. Why is this chemical analysis conducted with such rigorous scrutiny? The composition of the earth dictates the entire future of the plantation, as a single missing element can cause the entire harvest to fail. But this is just the beginning. Organic compost and decomposed manure are integrated into the ground with surgical precision to establish a soft and highly fertile foundation. One can notice how the soil changes texture as the blades of the mixing equipment rotate at a constant speed to ensure homogeneity. Heavy leveling machinery then moves across the fields to sculpt the terrain into its final form. These mechanical units create long geometric ridges that extend in perfectly straight lines toward the distant horizon. Everything only gets more complicated as the agricultural infrastructure is finalized. In modern industrial farms, the preparation reaches a new technical level. One can notice how drip irrigation lines are buried deep within these earthen ridges, functioning like an invisible circulatory system hidden beneath the surface. It seems simple to water a field, but in reality, this subterranean network ensures that every individual drop of water travels directly to the root zone to eliminate any possibility of evaporation or waste. This represents a colossal infrastructure built specifically to sustain and support millions of plant lives that are currently on the verge of emergence. And this is not the limit. Within this landscape of meticulously prepared earth, the most improbable protagonist makes its appearance. It is the seed. One can notice the shocking contrast of scale between the massive machinery and the miniature biological capsules. The process is only gaining momentum as the farmers initiate the next phase of the planting cycle. 1,000 small seeds could easily vanish beneath the tip of a single finger. Why is such extreme miniaturization necessary for a crop that eventually sustains entire urban populations? It would seem that these tiny grains are fragile, yet they carry the complete biological code required to fuel massive cities. The answer lies in the precision of the early growth phase, where the smallest error in the first few days would result in a total loss of the future harvest. These seeds are never distributed at random across the soil. Instead, they are deposited into specialized trays, housed within high-tech greenhouses that function as biological fortresses. It is visible how the automated systems maintain internal conditions with military-grade rigor, adjusting every decimal point of environmental data. But this is just the beginning. The equipment gradually regulates the temperature and humidity to create the perfect incubator. Within a period of exactly 7 days, the biological process accelerates and life explodes from the trays. One can notice how small green sprouts emerge, appearing delicate and highly vulnerable to any external change. Everything only gets more complicated as the plants prepare for the transition to the open environment. The seedlings do not remain in this controlled climate indefinitely. Once they reach a height of between 15 and 20 centimeters and develop sufficiently robust stems, the critical moment of the transplant arrives. At first glance, moving a plant seems simple, but in reality, this is a high-risk operation that determines the survival of the entire crop. To prevent the thermal shock associated with the intense midday heat, armies of workers or automated transplanting machines begin the movement early in the morning. The precision of the placement is vital. The machines position each individual seedling with an exact spacing of 50 centimeters from its neighbor. If the plants are situated too close together, they will inevitably compete for limited soil resources and perish. Conversely, if the distance exceeds the established parameters, valuable agricultural space is wasted. The process is only gaining momentum as the roots make contact with the field. One can notice how the first irrigation system is activated the moment the seedlings touch the actual soil. This immediate hydration seals the physical pact between the young plant and the earth, ensuring the transition is successful. The water flows steadily across the rows, marking the end of the nursery stage. 100% of the attention is now focused on the field as the aggressive growth phase begins. For the next several weeks, the agricultural expanse transforms into a complex living organism that demands uninterrupted monitoring from the engineering teams. The tomato plant does not develop in isolation, but is instead meticulously guided through every stage of its biological cycle. Why is such constant surveillance necessary for a simple plant? One might assume nature could take its course without human intervention, but without the precision of modern technology, the delicate balance of the crop would collapse under the unpredictable weight of the environment. Humidity sensors buried deep within the soil layers transmit data in real time to the centralized computers governing the irrigation systems. This is a matter of critical physical equilibrium where any deviation leads to total loss. If the plant receives an excess of water, the internal hydraulic pressure increases until the fruit explodes and the skin cracks, rendering it completely useless for industrial processing. The equipment gradually regulates the flow to prevent dehydration. If the root system receives too little water, the biological growth process halts entirely. It is a walk on a high-tension wire that continues for several months. One can notice how workers move through the rows to perform mandatory pruning as the plants expand. It seems simple to let the foliage grow, but in reality, extra leaves are removed to ensure the solar radiation reaches the fruit directly rather than being absorbed by the green canopy. The process is only gaining momentum. The fruit begins its physical transformation as a hard green sphere of dense matter. One can notice the slow shift in color as the internal chemistry alters the surface of the skin. It transitions slowly into a pale yellow, then shifts toward a vibrant orange as the pigments develop. Finally, the tomato reaches that deep and intense red hue that signals the absolute peak of sugar concentration and chemical maturity. The camera glides along the rows where the saturation of the crop indicates the perfect moment for the harvest to commence. Thus, the plant completes its development cycle, reaching the standard required for the next stage of the production chain. 100% of the fruit's life cycle shifts toward inevitable decay the moment a tomato turns red. Why must the industry move faster than the biological clock of decomposition? Nature dictates a ruthless timeline, and the harvest represents the peak of operational tension where every minute lost results in the breakdown of organic tissue. This is the critical juncture where the destination of the fruit bifurcates into two distinct logistical paths based on the final utility of the crop. Fresh produce destined for local markets requires a manual and exceptionally delicate approach. Skilled workers navigate the rows to perform a gentle twisting motion on each individual fruit to ensure the protective skin remains unruptured. But for the industrial processing sector responsible for mass-produced sauces and ketchup, this human delicacy is replaced by the sheer scale of mechanical power. Giant metal harvesters, often weighing tens of tons, enter the fields to begin a high-velocity extraction process. The machines advance along the planting lines with a relentless pace that dwarfs manual labor. One can notice how these industrial harvesters process dozens of tons every 60 minutes without picking individual fruits. Instead, the equipment engulfs the entire plant or utilizes high-frequency mechanical agitators that cause the vine to vibrate at a precise resonance. This specific frequency ensures that only the heavy, ripe tomatoes detach and fall onto the internal conveyor belts, while the green, lighter plants remain anchored to the soil. But this is just the beginning. It seems like a display of chaotic force, but in reality, it is a calculation of controlled physics. Once the tomatoes are separated from the earth, they are immediately covered to shield them from direct solar radiation. Heat acts as a primary catalyst for spoilage, and if the internal temperature of the fruit rises beyond a certain threshold, the cargo begins to liquefy prematurely. One can see how the equipment gradually fills waiting trucks with thousands of kilograms of raw material. Everything only gets more complicated as the logistics phase begins. Heavy transport vehicles loaded with tons of red cargo accelerate down the highways to beat the clock. They operate within a strict window of only a few hours before the chemical degradation of the sugars and acids renders the load unusable. The processing facility operates on a zero-delay schedule because the factory cannot wait for the natural decay to take hold. The chaos of the organic harvest finally meets the cold, sterile order of industrial stainless steel at the processing plant. It is visible how the trucks tilt their beds to discharge the red mass into deep channels of rapidly flowing water. A transition to the next level of automation occurs here. The human element is removed from the physical handling of the fruit as automated systems and hydraulic currents take complete control of the movement. The tomatoes move through the flumes toward the cleaning stations where the machines assume total responsibility for the transformation. Thus, the raw harvest completes its journey from the field and enters the first phase of industrial refinement. Rotating brushes and high-pressure nozzles attack the field debris, removing caked earth, loose stones, and organic leaves from the harvest. Why is this initial scrubbing so aggressive for such a delicate fruit? It only looks obvious that a simple rinse would suffice, but in reality, residual soil would contaminate the entire batch during the heating process. What emerges from this washing tunnel is a brilliant flowing river of perfect red spheres. Scanning systems and optical lasers analyze every single tomato that traverses the conveyor belt at high speeds. This is where technology surpasses the capabilities of the human eye. The equipment gradually scans for microscopic defects that would remain invisible to even the most attentive worker. But this is just the beginning. A single green tomato or a fruit marked by a small black spot triggers an immediate response from the automated sensors. One can notice how the system fires a precise jet of compressed air with millisecond accuracy. The defective fruit is ejected from the production line like a high-velocity projectile. The process is only gaining momentum. Only the red elite survives this rigorous selection phase. Everything else is redirected toward the production of animal feed or organic fertilizer, ensuring that not a single gram of the harvest is wasted. It is visible how the rejects fall into separate collection chutes while the main flow continues forward. Cleaned, inspected, and uniform, the survivors are now prepared for the final sacrifice. To transform a solid fruit into a smooth, homogeneous sauce, the outer skin must disappear entirely. The industrial method for achieving this is brutally efficient. It gets more complex further on. The tomatoes enter a specialized water chamber where the next stage of physical transformation begins. The equipment maintains constant pressure as the fruit moves through the liquid. This transition prepares the material for the thermal processing that follows. The batch moves quietly toward the peeling station as the first phase of the transformation concludes. 2,900 degrees is the approximate temperature required to initiate this instantaneous thermal surge. Why does the outer layer of the fruit separate so violently from its core during such a brief exposure to heat? The intense thermal energy causes the microscopic moisture trapped directly beneath the skin of the tomato to reach a boiling point and expand in a mere fraction of a second. But this is just the beginning. The internal pressure builds until the skin literally explodes and detaches from the underlying pulp. At first glance, this rapid destruction seems chaotic, but in reality, it is a precisely calculated physical reaction designed to preserve the integrity of the vegetable. One can notice how the equipment gradually transitions to the next stage of mechanical separation. The process is only gaining momentum. Automated systems then guide the product toward a series of soft rubber rollers or high-pressure air nozzles. It is visible how these mechanisms gently grip and strip away the loosened fragments without damaging the softened interior. Everything only gets more complicated as the sensors monitor the thoroughness of the removal. Because any remaining peel would compromise the homogeneity of the final product, the mechanical friction must be constant and uniform. The skins are discarded while the bare pulp moves further along the production chain. From here, the transformation moves to the next phase of processing. 100% of the raw fruit mass is transformed once the red flesh remains exposed. Why is the total destruction of the original shape required at this specific stage? At first glance, the tomatoes appear robust, but the structural integrity of the fruit is immediately compromised to ensure a smooth consistency. Industrial crushers systematically pulverize the mass, forcing the material through fine stainless steel sieves that extract every seed and tough fiber. The equipment gradually produces a thick, rich, and aromatic liquid. Depending on the requirements of the final product, this pulp enters the 15 Great Pyramids of Giza would fail to represent the sheer volume of toxic black sludge that has permeated the world's waters over the last decade. 198 million pounds of petroleum have been spilled into the global oceans during this relatively short span of time. Why does such catastrophic environmental damage continue to occur despite modern safety protocols? This scale of pollution often stems from the structural failure of massive transport vessels that dominate international trade routes. One can notice how the balance of marine ecosystems shifts instantly when a hull breaches. But this is just the beginning of understanding the industrial impact on the sea. The MT Solar, recognized as one of the largest vessels in maritime history, represents a pinnacle of industrial engineering that ultimately succumbed to the elements. When the ship spilled its cargo, the magnitude of the disaster challenged even the most advanced recovery technologies. It only looks obvious to assume that such a giant is indestructible, but in reality, the sea exerts forces that can compromise even reinforced steel. The equipment gradually fails under the pressure of millions of gallons of liquid weight. Automated labeling systems apply the final identity to each product, marking the specific batch and production date with high-speed precision. This ensures that every individual unit is traceable throughout the global supply chain. It seems simple to mark a container, but in reality, this data is the foundation of modern logistics and safety. Robots configured for palletizing then begin to stack these boxes into perfectly aligned towers. Everything only gets more complicated as the weight increases. One can notice how the mechanical arms move with calculated fluidity to ensure the center of gravity remains stable. Forklifts navigate the warehouse floor to load distribution trucks as the production cycle nears its conclusion. The process is only gaining momentum as the goods move toward the consumer market. It is visible how the metal structures and laser sensors coordinate to manage the flow of finished goods. All of this massive infrastructure of steel and heavy machinery exists solely to preserve a small fruit that began its life smaller than the head of a pin. The camera glides along the rows of millions of cans now traveling across oceans and highways to reach their final destination. Patience from farmers and the absolute precision of mechanical engineering merge to create the final product found in a common kitchen. When a container of tomato paste is opened, it represents the conclusion of a months-long struggle against the natural elements. Nature is effectively tamed and preserved through the application of human ingenuity. This demonstrates the true power of industrial scale, where raw biological material is transformed into a shelf-stable resource. The transition to the next level of consumption happens the moment the seal is broken. One can notice how the industrial chain remains hidden behind the simplicity of the final ingredient. Every millimeter of the production line was designed to withstand the physical demands of high-volume processing. From the early stages of growth to the final dispatch, the narrative of the product is one of constant mechanical supervision. The material is ready to move to the next processing phase without haste. Thus ends one of the key stages of industrial production. 550,000 gallons of thick industrial fuel were released into the depths during a single catastrophic failure of maritime logistics. Why did a multi-billion-dollar engineering infrastructure prove completely powerless against such a localized environmental disaster? It would seem that modern robotics and chemical dispersants could easily neutralize a spill of this magnitude, but in reality, high-tech solutions failed to stop the spreading poison. The answer lies in a surprising transition from advanced machinery to the most basic organic materials discarded by society. Everything only gets more complicated as one examines the structural integrity of the vessel involved. 11 is the day of the month in August 2006, when the tanker known as MT Solar 1 faced its final moments in the waters surrounding the Philippines. The ship was operating under a heavy contract for the Petron Corporation, acting as a massive conduit for fossil fuels. One can notice how the aging steel hull groaned under the strain of an excessive and poorly calculated cargo weight. The vessel did not simply sink. It plummeted 3,000 feet into the crushing pressure of the oceanic abyss. But this is just the beginning. The cargo was not standard gasoline, which typically evaporates upon contact with the atmosphere, but rather oil bunker. It only looks obvious to treat all oil spills the same, but in reality, bunker fuel is a dense, viscous poison specifically engineered for the heavy engines of industrial ships. One can notice the way this thick sludge clings to every surface it touches, resisting traditional filtration methods. The camera glides along the surface of the water where the dark, heavy mass began its slow expansion toward the coastline. The process of environmental destruction was only gaining momentum as the engineering failures became apparent. Technological systems costing billions of dollars were rendered useless by the sheer viscosity of the bunker fuel. It is visible how the expensive robots and synthetic booms struggled to contain the heavy industrial waste. Instead of futuristic interventions, the solution eventually emerged from the most unlikely sources: human hair and discarded coconut husks. These organic wastes humiliated modern engineering by performing the task that high-precision machines could not. From here, the narrative shifts toward the physical reality of how these simple materials interacted with the thickest sludge on the planet. 3,700 acres of a vibrant underwater ecosystem were suffocated under a dense layer of toxic contamination. Why did the local authorities immediately ban all fishing activities across the entire region? This measure was a desperate response to the total death of the crystalline waters surrounding an island once globally famous for its white sand beaches and sweet mangoes. But without this prohibition, the health risks to the population would have far exceeded the already catastrophic economic damage. One can notice how the dark substance coat the roots of mangrove forests, which serve as vital nurseries for countless marine species. The destruction occurred with terrifying speed. Recifes of coral that required several centuries of slow growth to form were transformed into lifeless black stone in a single night. This environmental collapse struck the very center of the local economy with the force of a physical blow. 20,000 fishermen woke up to find their livelihoods completely erased as the water became a dead zone. It gets more complex further on. Families throughout the island lost their entire source of income as the contamination spread through the food chain. The process is only gaining momentum as the social consequences manifest. Children were forced to leave school because their parents could no longer afford the basic costs of education. The equipment used by the few remaining cleanup crews moves slowly across the blackened shoreline where white sand once lay. It only looks obvious that the damage is environmental, but in reality, the structural collapse of the local society follows the path of the oil. One can notice the silence in the ports where hundreds of boats now sit idle and decaying. The economic displacement has left thousands of homes without the means to sustain daily life. Thus, The community faces a total transition from a thriving maritime hub to a zone of absolute stagnation. The environmental tragedy concludes its initial phase, leaving behind a landscape of silent reefs and empty nets. 100% of the most advanced international equipment arrived to confront the environmental crisis. Floating containment barriers, specialized vessels equipped with mechanical skimmers, and industrial-grade absorbents were deployed to the site. It seemed like a technological army mobilized for total war. Why did this arsenal of high-precision machinery fail to stop the spread of the pollution? The equipment was prepared for standard oil spills, but the reality of the situation was far more complex. The bunker oil possessed a physical density that resisted conventional extraction methods. Instead of remaining on the surface where it could be collected, the substance behaved differently. One can notice how the dense material does not simply float, but instead begins to agglutinate into heavy masses. It adheres to jagged rock formations, penetrates deep into the porous sand, and flows silently beneath the floating barriers. But this is just the beginning of the complications. Western machines designed for lighter petroleum variants effectively turned into useless scrap metal in these conditions. The mechanical skimmers became clogged, and the suction system stalled against the viscous weight of the fuel. It only looks obvious that technology should solve the problem, but in reality, the physics of the bunker oil rendered the sophisticated tools inert. The geography of the region presented a second, even more formidable nightmare for the engineers. The Marine Reserve was located at a significant distance from any industrial hubs. Access was limited strictly to narrow, winding roads that could not support the weight of heavy machinery or transport trucks. No American or European cleanup vessels were stationed within a reachable radius. At first glance, the situation appeared to be a total logistical deadlock. Everything only gets more complicated as the window for intervention closes. Faced with an imminent ecological apocalypse and the total defeat of cutting-edge technology, the nation was forced to make a drastic decision. The high-tech approach had reached its limit. Therefore, the authorities had to pivot toward a strategy that ignored conventional industrial protocols. One can notice the tension as the focus shifts away from the failed machines toward an alternative solution that would define the next phase of the operation. 170,000 millimeters of oil were successfully extracted in a single real-world test using 25,000 pounds of collected hair. Why was such an unconventional biological material chosen to combat a massive environmental disaster? At first glance, the idea of using discarded fibers from barbershops seems like an impossible solution for a technical failure of this magnitude. But without this organic intervention, the toxic black slick would have continued its spread across the ocean surface unabated. The mobilization across the country began almost instantly as metal and plastic containment systems failed. From Manila to Cebu, thousands of hair salons ceased their daily disposal routines and began stockpiling remnants for the cause. One can notice how university students formed long, orderly lines not for social events, but to undergo head-shaving procedures to donate their own fibers. This massive collection effort transformed millions of individual strands into a strategic resource for saving the marine ecosystem. Human hair possesses a unique surface structure characterized by millions of microscopic scales. These biological fibers are scientifically classified as both oleophilic and hydrophobic, meaning they exhibit a natural attraction to oil while simultaneously repelling water. It gets more complex further on. Each individual strand functions like a miniature tube that grips the viscous oil molecules and refuses to release them into the surrounding environment. The camera glides along the water surface, where these organic mats float with ease. Unlike synthetic sponges that absorb water and lose buoyancy, hair remains focused exclusively on the toxic substance. It stays afloat on the waves, continuously pulling the black poison from the water without becoming saturated by the ocean itself. And this is not the limit. The physical properties of the hair allow it to maintain its structural integrity even when heavily coated in crude. The efficacy of this method is technically startling when observed in practice. During the response to the Costco Busan disaster in San Francisco, empirical data confirmed the immense absorption capacity of the material. One can notice how 1 single pound of hair is capable of capturing 1.5 gallons of spilled oil. The process is only gaining momentum as more data validates the physics behind the organic fibers. Large-scale tests have further solidified these findings with staggering numerical evidence. 25,000 pounds of hair managed to absorb 170,000 millimeters of oil during a controlled deployment. The equipment gradually removes the saturated fibers from the water, leaving a cleaner surface behind. Transition to the next level. This biological approach proved that when industrial engineering reached its limits, the solution lay in the physics of natural materials. The material is ready to move to the next processing phase without haste. Tens of meters of nylon netting filled with human hair stretch across the ocean surface to function as biological barriers for water purification. Why would such an organic material be deployed in the open sea? It only looks obvious that a free and universally available resource would be the perfect solution for environmental filtration. But without a calculated assessment of chemical stability, this organic technology introduces a significant technical complication. The hair remains trapped within the mesh as the equipment gradually monitors the absorption of pollutants. The material exhibits a severe structural defect because human hair requires an immense amount of time to decompose in natural conditions. It is visible how the fibers resist the natural breakdown processes of the saltwater environment for years. This is not the limit of the complications. Modern hair is frequently saturated with synthetic dyes and aggressive salon chemicals that risk leaching back into the fragile marine ecosystem. Humanity required a substance that was even more abundant and entirely free of industrial contaminants. But this is just the beginning of the search for a purely natural alternative. One can notice the transition to more sustainable raw materials as the process only gains momentum. From here, the search for a superior biological filter moves toward the next level of environmental integration. 370,000 gallons of industrial fuel spilled into the ocean when a massive vessel capsized off the coast of Bataan in 2023. Why did the Philippine Coast Guard immediately deploy thousands of bags of dried coconut husks instead of calling for hair donations like in previous disasters? 17 years after the original environmental crisis, authorities understood that nature had already provided a superior solution that had been ignored and piled up like farm waste for nearly 2 decades. The answer lies in the unique physical properties of the coconut fiber, technically referred to as coir, which serves as a highly efficient organic absorbent. One can notice how the water darkens as the heavy oil spreads across the surface, yet the response is now mechanical and calculated rather than panicked. Coast Guard personnel dragged mountains of sacks to the shoreline, utilizing a material that had been treated as industrial refuse for generations. This was not a desperate improvisation, but the deliberate application of a specialized technical resource. For decades, global agricultural systems in nations like the Philippines, Indonesia, and India have generated massive quantities of coconuts. The water is extracted for consumption, the meat is processed for food, and the wood is utilized in construction, but the outer shell was historically discarded. The husk constitutes 35% of the total weight of the fruit, yet between 85 and 90% of the world's coconut fiber was traditionally burned or left to rot. It only looks obvious now, but treating this material as useless waste was a significant industrial oversight given the historical data available. During the Second World War, military engineers recognized the immense value of this substance, labeling it the golden fiber due to its extreme durability and resistance to the elements. The camera glides along the historical records, showing how armies manufactured camouflage netting and life jackets from the material. They discovered through rigorous field use that the fiber does not undergo biological decay even when submerged in salt water for extended periods. Everything only gets more complicated as the scale of production increases. Industrial machines now process these husks to separate the tough fibers from the pith, ensuring the material is ready for environmental deployment. The equipment gradually strips the outer casing, revealing the golden strands that once protected soldiers and now shield the coastline from chemical contamination. This technical legacy from the mid-20th century was revived to combat the modern industrial threat in the Bataan Peninsula. The process is only gaining momentum as more regions recognize the utility of this formerly discarded organic matter. Nature has effectively engineered a material that outperforms synthetic alternatives in specific maritime conditions. From here, the transformation moves to the next phase of processing. 45% of the structure of coconut fiber is composed of lignin, a technical fact revealed when examining the material under a microscope. Why is this specific concentration of organic matter so critical for environmental protection? It would seem like any plant matter could soak up spills in the ocean. But without this high level of lignin, the material would lack the necessary molecular attraction to capture hydrocarbons efficiently. Lignin functions as a natural polymer that acts like a high-powered magnet specifically for oil. This is the highest concentration of lignin found in any plant species on the entire planet. Engineers have observed that the internal structure of the fiber is packed with microcapillaries. One can notice how these millions of invisible tubes function like microscopic straws to pull liquids upward. During controlled tests conducted in Thailand, this coconut fiber absorbed 30 times more oil than common straw. But this is just the beginning. The equipment gradually records how the material behaves over long durations in the water. In Malaysia, research teams proved that the fiber can hold oil for 72 hours without releasing a single drop back into the environment. It only looks obvious that a sponge-like material would leak under pressure, but in reality, the capillary tension keeps the oil trapped inside the structure. The process is only gaining momentum. When the fiber is deployed onto a spill, it saturates with oil almost instantaneously. One can notice the specialized nets being gathered after the absorption is complete. The process does not end at this stage. The oil is squeezed out of the fibers to be sent for recycling, while the same coconut material is prepared for reuse. This creates a functional infinite cycle of cleaning and recovery. Everything only gets more complicated when the fiber finally reaches the end of its mechanical life. Instead of becoming waste, the worn material is converted into organic fertilizer or processed into biofuel. It is visible how the fibers transition from an industrial tool back into a natural resource. This method is 20 to 30 times cheaper than traditional synthetic barriers used by cleanup crews. Metal and plastic booms require heavy maintenance and high manufacturing costs. The coconut fiber serves as a self-sustaining and cost-effective alternative for large-scale maritime accidents. The material is ready to move to the next processing phase without haste. 300% is the sudden leap in value for what was previously discarded as agricultural waste. The price of coconut fiber has tripled in an instant, transforming a byproduct into a strategic resource. Why did this humble material suddenly become more valuable than the crops themselves? It seems simple to overlook a husk, but the answer lies in its molecular structure. The United Nations has officially designated coconut fiber as the most effective biodegradable oil absorbent known to humanity, surpassing all other natural alternatives. But this is just the beginning. One can notice how entire factories are now appearing for the sole purpose of manufacturing specialized containment barriers from this raw material. These industrial facilities process the husks with high-speed mechanical shredders, turning the dense exterior into a porous, high-surface area mesh. Everything only gets more complicated as the scale of production increases to meet global demand for ocean protection. While farmers are effectively saving the world's oceans using these natural fibers, researchers in the most expensive laboratories on the planet are attempting to replicate or surpass this efficiency. The process is only gaining momentum. In the United States, the Argonne National Laboratory has dedicated years of intensive research and millions of dollars in funding to develop a synthetic competitor known as the oleosponge. It only looks obvious that a natural product would be the final answer, but in reality, high-level chemistry seeks even greater precision. This synthetic masterpiece is created through a complex technical procedure known as sequential infiltration synthesis. One can notice the equipment gradually depositing atomic layers to modify the internal structure of the material, aiming to reverse its natural properties. The laboratory technicians operate the synthesis chambers with millimetric precision, ensuring that the chemical vapors penetrate the substrate deeply. This is not the limit of their ambition. They use these advanced methods to ensure the sponge can be reused hundreds of times without losing its structural integrity or its ability to trap hydrocarbons. The equipment works ceaselessly, moving the material through various stages of chemical bonding. From here, the transformation moves to the next phase of processing, where nature and high-tech engineering continue to compete for the most efficient solution. 90 times its own weight in oil is the volume a specialized nanotech sponge is capable of absorbing through molecules that actively attract hydrocarbons. Why is such an advanced material not used globally for every maritime spill? This complexity makes the sponge extremely expensive and nearly impossible to manufacture on a mass scale for immediate emergencies in remote island locations. One can notice how the intricate structure of the material requires laboratory conditions that are simply unavailable during a sudden ecological crisis. It seems simple to solve the problem with automation, but reality dictates otherwise. Engineers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology designed the Sea Swarm, a futuristic solar-powered robot utilizing a conveyor belt of nanowires to lick oil from the water surface. The design was intended to function autonomously for weeks, with the promise of a robotic army patrolling the seas. But this is just the beginning of the complications. 10 years have passed since the announcement, and these machines have not been deployed in any actual large-scale disaster. The technology is far too fragile for the brutal conditions of the open ocean. Canadian engineers chose the path of brute force instead of delicate robotics. The company Extreme Spill Technology developed specialized vessels that resemble floating tanks, capable of operating in waves of 3 meters and high wind environments. These are conditions that would force standard recovery boats to return to port immediately. It is visible how the heavy hulls cut through the water, yet the Canadian government paid $9,500,000 for a single fleet. The cost of this heavy equipment is astronomical. At first glance, the comparison is startling. $1,000,000 ships and nanotech sponges versus the humble coconut husk. The husk costs only pennies and grows naturally on trees, serving as a lesson in humility for high-technology solutions. But this is not the limit of how countries prepare for disasters. There is one specific place in the world where they do not depend on luck or low-cost materials alone. Norway, a wealthy and environmentally conscious nation, performs an action that looks like madness. They intentionally pour real crude oil into the sea. Every year, under strict regulatory control, the government authorizes the release of oil into the freezing waters of the north. Why would they choose to contaminate their own territory? Because Norway survives on petroleum, with 30% of the national budget originating from this black gold. They understand that a single unmanaged error could permanently destroy their entire economy. They call these operations the oil-on-water exercises. The process is only gaining momentum as they move from theory to physical testing. These are not computer simulations, but cold reality where they test ships, sensor-equipped aircraft, and containment booms in the worst possible scenarios. One can notice how the equipment struggles against giant waves and sub-zero temperatures. The data gathered here ensures that their response is calibrated for the actual physical forces of the ocean. Thus, the preparation for the next inevitable spill continues in the harsh environment of the north. 22 million pounds of oil leaked into the world's oceans in 2024 alone, marking a sharp and concerning escalation in maritime disasters. This surge in volume coincides with a period where cargo vessels are reaching unprecedented scales, carrying heavier loads across increasingly volatile shipping lanes. Why does Norway maintain the most rapid and efficient response system in the world? At first glance, their methods seem extreme as they utilize the hazardous material itself for training. This audacity to train with a real enemy allows them to prove that the only way to defeat a disaster is to simulate the struggle against it directly. The threat grows more complex as environmental conditions shift. One can notice how modern tropical storms have increased in intensity by 15 to 20% compared to previous decades. This added force is now capable of exerting enough physical pressure to snap a modern steel ship hull completely in half. But this is just the beginning. It seems simple to assume that once the surface is cleaned, the danger vanishes. In reality, only 20 to 30% of spilled oil is ever successfully recovered by mechanical means. The remaining volume undergoes a physical transformation, losing buoyancy and sinking toward the seafloor. It settles into the benthic mud, remaining chemically active for 10, 20, or even 40 years. It does not end at this stage. The equipment monitors these toxic time bombs as they lay silent in the deep sediment. A single coral reef coated in crude oil requires at least 2 decades to reach even a basic level of recovery if it manages to survive at all. In the waters of Brazil, unidentified oil deposits caused the death of thousands of hatchling sea turtles. Similar zones of biological silence have emerged in Thailand, where dead zones now exist that can no longer support fish populations. Everything only gets more complicated. The camera glides across the visual of 15 pyramids of oil, representing the total volume suffocating the planet. The industry continues to allocate billions of dollars toward promising automated solutions, specialized robotics, and molecular nanotechnology. The process is only gaining momentum. This brings the focus back to the historical record of the MT Solar, where the physical limits of containment were tested. The ocean retains the chemical signature of these events long after the surface appears clear. The material continues its slow degradation in the dark, transitioning into a calm but permanent stage of the environmental record. Thus, the data concludes this phase of the analysis, opening the road to understanding the long-term impact on the global ecosystem. $7 million was the final sum the nation of Chad allocated to deploy a biological ghost into a terminal landscape. Why would a creature declared extinct 30 years ago, transported under the strict security of military cargo, succeed where every modern concrete barrier has failed? The answer to how a single footprint can revive a dying planet begins with a calculated gamble against the advancing desert. This mission represents a shift in technical philosophy, suggesting that the true strength of industry lies in mechanical cooperation with the environment rather than direct opposition. Why has the progress of human technology often proved insufficient to halt environmental collapse? In many industrial disasters, the resulting destruction of ecosystems and local livelihoods leaves conventional machinery powerless. But in reality, the solution emerges from what was once discarded as waste. One can notice how the simple fiber of a coconut, formerly considered industrial refuse, is transformed into a robust physical shield. Similarly, human hair, once treated as mere debris, is woven into technical nets that actively preserve marine life from pollutants. The equipment gradually adapts to these biological solutions as the process gains momentum. It only looks obvious to build larger machines, but the most effective shields are now grown in trees. Everything only gets more complicated as the scale of the threat increases. 60% of the territory of Chad has already been consumed by the sands and is now effectively dead. This colossal area exceeds the combined geographical surface of the states of Texas and California. It is visible how the Sahara functions as a relentless geological crushing machine, advancing toward the south and devouring fertile soil in its path. Walls of reinforced concrete and investments totaling billions of dollars in advanced technology have been unable to arrest this expansion. At first glance, the desert seems unstoppable, but the introduction of a lost species marks a transition to the next level of restoration. One can notice how the biological agents begin to interact with the parched earth. The camera glides along the vast perimeter where the desert once reigned supreme. The project concludes this phase, opening the road to a slow and steady ecological formation. From here, the transformation moves to the next phase of processing as the environment begins to stabilize under the influence of the reintroduced species. 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit represents the lethal thermal threshold of the hottest point on the Earth's surface. A critical situation emerges as 30% of the nation's remaining territory teeters on the edge of a geographical abyss, prepared to dissolve into sterile dust. Why is this ecological transformation so difficult to detect before it is too late? The sound of this impending disaster remains perfectly silent, yet it manifests visually through the physical degradation of the environment. The soil cracks beneath every footstep with the brittle texture of dried fish scales. This serves as the definitive physical evidence that every last drop of moisture has been drained from the subterranean layers. One can notice how rivers that once surged with kinetic force have been reduced to nothing more than hollow scars upon the landscape. Lake Chad, formerly the primary life-sustaining source for millions of residents, has suffered a drastic reduction in its surface area. Since the decade of the 1960s, the water body has shrunk to precisely 1/10 of its original dimensions. This is a total collapse of the hydrological system. But this is just the beginning. The process is only gaining momentum. They attempted every possible engineering solution to halt the expansion. Engineers pumped water from the deepest aquifers, used heavy machinery to plant millions of seeds, and constructed massive artificial barriers to obstruct the wind currents. Every human-led project failed when measured against the sheer brute force of the natural environment. The Sahara Desert continued its steady advancement, operating like a giant mechanical grinder crushing the fertile land. It only looks obvious that mechanical solutions would suffice. But in reality, engineers eventually realized that raw physical force would never succeed here. They required a technology that understood the internal logic of the terrain. This necessitated an autonomous unit capable of operating in extreme conditions where steel expands until it jams and heavy internal combustion motors fail from overheating. The solution did not emerge from a traditional manufacturing factory, but rather from the long process of biological evolution. Meet the scimitar oryx. To the untrained eye, this creature appears as a simple antelope possessing horns curved like the blades of ancient warriors. Everything only gets more complicated under the rigorous lens of technical engineering. In this view, the animal is a biological machine of extreme precision. Its entire body is encapsulated by a coat of silvery white fur, which functions as a high-efficiency thermal shield. The camera glides along the animal's flank, where the specialized hair reflects solar radiation away from the vital organs to maintain internal stability. Transition to the next level. 46 degrees Celsius is the blistering heat level where the atmospheric conditions begin to pull moisture directly from the cells of most living organisms. Why does the oryx not succumb to such extreme thermal stress like other mammals? At first glance, the animal appears to be enduring the environment through sheer stamina, but in reality, it utilizes an internal thermal regulation system that functions with the complexity of advanced engineering. While most mammals would experience total biological collapse while attempting to cool themselves, the oryx bypasses the need for perspiration entirely. It does not sweat, preventing the loss of vital fluids that are impossible to replace in the desert. The process is only gaining momentum. Instead of fighting the external heat, the oryx allows its own body temperature to rise to levels that would be fatal to almost any other creature on the planet. This allows it to conserve every single drop of precious water within its system. One can notice how the wide hooves of this animal act as specialized excavation tools rather than mere feet for locomotion. They function with mechanical efficiency, allowing the oryx to traverse shifting dunes without the need. 120 is the number of individual specimens whose genetic material was preserved to prevent the total disappearance of a species officially extinct in the wild. Why did the biological shield of the Sahara Desert collapse so completely after their departure? One might notice that without the constant action of hooves to break the surface of the earth, the soil became hermetically sealed. Without this natural plowing, the indigenous grasses perished, and the shifting sands of the dunes claimed the territory. But this is just the beginning. To reverse this ecological apocalypse, engineers and biologists had to reboot a lost biological technology. The renaissance of the species did not originate in the desert heat, but within the absolute stillness of the ice. The rescue operation commenced inside the high-technology laboratories of the Smithsonian Institute in the United States. In this facility, the environment is strictly regulated at -196 degrees Celsius. It is visible how the genetic code of the species remains suspended in time within these massive tanks of liquid nitrogen. The equipment gradually maintains this cryogenic state to ensure the survival of the DNA. Everything only gets more complicated as the transition to the next level begins. At first glance, the process of reproduction appears to be a matter of simple biology, but in reality, it required a revolutionary technical breakthrough. Scientists engineered a precise method of artificial insemination that avoided the use of anesthesia entirely. This was a mandatory technical requirement because administering sedatives to a stressed animal weighing 200 kilograms often triggers a fatal thermal shock. Because of this innovation, the success rate for reproduction climbed to over 70%. It is visible how the process became a calculated sequence of biological engineering. The process is only gaining momentum. 120 distinct samples of genetic material traveled across the globe from the United States, France, and Abu Dhabi. This biological cargo moved through the air toward the center of the African continent. This logistical operation allowed researchers to restore the genetic diversity to a level exceeding 90% of the original ancestral population. One can notice how this ensures the new herds are not fragile clones, but robust biological units capable of survival. The process does not end at this stage. The entire endeavor functioned with the precision of military logistics. Live cargo flew thousands of kilometers inside heavy transport aircraft, effectively ferrying biology back to its original environmental theater. This specific application of biotechnology reduced the overall transport costs by 80%. It proves that modern scientific systems serve as the primary mechanism for unlocking the restoration of the past. The transformation concludes this phase, opening the road to the successful reintroduction of the species into its native habitat. 77,000 square kilometers is the colossal expanse of the Wadi Rim Wadi Akim Reserve, where the landing took place. Why was such a massive territory, larger than the entire nation of Ireland, selected for this operation? Scientists required a vast undisturbed landscape to reintroduce a species, leading to an initial investment of $7 million during the first phase of the project. This capital funded the construction of specialized stations, satellite monitoring centers, and adaptation camps designed for the animals. In March of 2016, the first 21 oryx landed on Chadian soil. Each animal functioned as a vital asset, fitted with a high-technology global positioning system collar, valued at more than $2,000. These electronic devices utilized the Iridium satellite network to transmit precise coordinates, heart rates, and internal temperatures. But this is just the beginning. One can notice how the equipment gradually gathers data in real time. At first glance, the mission appeared successful when the first calf was born 6 months later. But in reality, the Sahara Desert acts as a furnace that does not forgive technical errors. The initial euphoria rapidly shifted into a state of red alert. Within a few short months, 1/3 of the entire herd had perished due to the extreme conditions. It is visible how the impetuous heat of the Sahara dominates the environment. During the daylight hours, soil temperatures rise to such extremes that they successfully incinerated the delicate electronic components inside the tracking collars. The wind blew at 49 degrees Celsius. Nightfall brought different threats as predators like jackals dragged away the weakened calves. They left behind nothing but the pulsing signal of a global positioning system unit beneath the starlit sky. The mission was hovering on the edge of total failure, yet the technical team refused to retreat. Everything only gets more complicated as the survival of the remaining herd becomes the priority. Engineers began drilling artificial wells dozens of meters deep into the earth. The equipment gradually reaches the water table to bring hydration to the entire population. This intervention secured a steady supply of water in a region where surface sources are non-existent. The project concludes this phase, opening the road to further stabilization of the herd. 90% is the survival rate reached by the species after shifting their entire operational zone toward the southern territories where vegetation still persisted. Why did this biological shift occur despite the presence of advanced machinery? The strategy was not based on technology, but on a behavioral adaptation that trained the animals to live exclusively at night, effectively avoiding the lethal rays of the sun. But this is just the beginning. The survival rate climbed from 65% to 90% as the system began to function autonomously. Here, the narrative enters the visual mathematics of terraforming, where the biological presence of the oryx achieves what no human-designed machine could manage on such a massive scale. It all begins with the physics of a single hoof and the mechanics of weight distribution. One can notice how the equipment of nature operates with silent efficiency. Everything starts with the basic physical properties of the animal's interaction with the terrain. When an oryx settles on the ground to rest amidst the intense heat of 49 degrees, its heavy body mass creates small depressions in the sand. At first glance, these indentations seem like insignificant traces of movement, but in reality, they serve as essential microbasins for the ecosystem. The process is only gaining momentum. When the rare rainfall finally arrives in the arid zone, these small pits hold every precious drop of water with high efficiency. This prevents the liquid from running off across the terrain or evaporating instantly upon contact with the hard, sun-baked surface. One can notice how these tiny wells transform into microscopic oases, concentrating moisture precisely where it can be utilized. It gets more complex further on. The simple physical act of walking across the landscape becomes a mechanical intervention. With their wide hooves, the animals break the dense crust of the dry soil, which would otherwise remain impenetrable to both air and water. This mechanical fracturing allows the earth to breathe, enabling atmospheric air to penetrate the deeper layers. The moisture from the air begins to seep into the broken ground, where the soil structure has been prepared for absorption. The equipment of the natural world continues its work, facilitating the slow transformation of the surface layer. From here, the transition to the next level of terraforming moves forward as the ground regains its capacity to support life.